Okay, let's begin. I am Lanice Antoine Shelley, and I'll be your host through constructive, healing-based conversations designed to illuminate the adoptee, parents, and the adoption curious. We center the topics around community, mentorship, leadership, and healing, so you get a multi-dimensional view that is ultimately empowering. These are the voices who could not speak when they were young. Hey y'all, if you've seen me on Instagram, I'm in my summer glow phase and I am unapologetic about it. My hair is luscious. Fun fact, I didn't start properly treating and doing my own hair until I was a grown adult because like many Black adoptees, no one showed me how to do my own hair. And because I love you all so much, I'm going to share with you my hair secret. I'm always on the lookout for things you'd love and things that will enhance your well-being inside and out. Reunifying Cosmetics sent me their Moisture Lock pomade and scalp and hair therapy oil from their Metamorphosis line, and it's so decadent, light, and nourishing, fam. This has become a hair routine staple. It has a soft lemongrass scent that people comment on when I walk by or when they're doing my hair because now I have boho locks. They also sent me a 15% discount link for you to try their products and hair tutorial service. And Unique Cosmetics is Black owned and operated by a mother and daughter duo dedicated to helping the adoptee community. Check out the link in the show notes. And this is for all ages, fam. So tell your friends. So come on, embark on a hair-loving journey with We Unique World. From interactive workshops to premium products, they're all about empowering you to embrace your unique hair journey. Because remember, all hair is good hair, especially when it's healthy. Hey friends, happy Saturday. Even though it's a rather gloomy and gray Saturday here in Chicago, I am enjoying a frolic, a whole day frolic actually. I had an after yoga street fair and this whimsical vintage family fair that I rode past and had to flip a wheelie. I don't know if I'm using that correctly, but turn around to get close to it and check it out. I didn't get anything there, but it was super cute to see the families running around with homemade flower wreaths on their heads. Tomorrow is Mother's Day, and I want to acknowledge those who have lost their mother or child, or those who have strained relationships with their child or parent. When holidays come up, it's easy to just marinate in what you don't have, what you're missing, or what you want and has been denied to you. Might I suggest being kind to yourself? Treating yourself with a frolic led by your inner child, led by the sole purpose of achieving pure delights. No matter what day it is, you deserve to be treated with gentility. This is not to bypass or ignore the feelings that are welling up to the surface. It's simply to remind yourself that these societal obligations are just a construct. They're made up, and you decide what weight or meaning you assign to them. And it's also a reminder to pour into yourself the love that you desire. My guest today is Nelson De Witt, who is an author, filmmaker, and technologist. This conversation was fascinating. Nelson was born in El Salvador and was raised here on the East Coast. He is another adoptee who managed to forge a relationship with his biological family after reunification, which you know always delights and fascinates me. We discuss coping mechanisms for his dyslexia, and for my dyslexia, because we both have it. We unpack Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, which is the common template of stories that involve a hero who goes on an adventure, is victorious in a decisive crisis, and comes home changed or transformed. The template goes like this. There's a call for adventure with a supernatural aid or guardian. And then the hero is met with challenges and temptations that lead him to an internal death and rebirth. Then the hero goes through a transformation, then an atonement, and then he finally returns to where he started. Nelson and I then talk about the complexities of reunifying with biological family and how he balances both worlds of adoptive and biological family. Nelson also shares what it means to be disappeared as one of El Salvador's disappeared children. And trust me, it's not anything you've heard of or that you're thinking of right now. This story will rock you. I was deeply expanded by this robust conversation. Nelson is a multi-passionate force of a human being, incredibly erudite and generous in spirit. This is one you're going to need to listen to more than once, I'm sure. Let's dig in. Oh, you use a typewriter?
It's a typewriter keyboard, so it's a regular Bluetooth keyboard, but it looks like a typewriter, and it makes lots of clacky sounds, which is fun.
Okay.
Kind of gets you in that writer. Yeah, you're like banging away at the keyboard.
So you're channeling your Hemingway, is that it?
That's it. Maybe with a little less alcoholism or whatever.
And a little less mental health issues. It's so sad. Yeah. That whole lineage, I think I read that there are about 7 or 9 people in that Hemingway family who've committed suicide.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very sad familial line. But I was grazing your website. Yeah. And there's just so much information that you are up to, so many things.
Yeah, maybe too much sometimes, but
no, I hear that. I wear a lot of hats too. Yeah. And well, when you have so much to say and so much to give, it's hard to figure out which avenue is the only avenue you're going to focus on, right? So,
right. Yeah.
So I commend you for being multi-hyphenate. I'm curious to know, though, about your dyslexia, because I'm dyslexic. And, and that's something that I have become more public about. Mm-hmm. And honestly, I had no idea. It's one of those things that I kind of self-diagnosed because all of the things kind of added up when I did my research.
Yeah.
So how did you discover that? Were you tested? And how do you navigate that?
I was tested in 3rd grade and then again in 11th grade. And my adoptive parents had me tested because the teacher reportedly said the stories that he reads aloud are always more interesting than what's written on the page. So I had this way of I could sort of guess the meaning of words based on the context. And so I sort of flew under the radar for a while. And then we got tested, and I think they said I was mildly dyslexic. And then in 11th grade, as I was applying to college, they did a comprehensive test where I went into Boston, hospital city there. And I met with a neuropsychologist or something. And she did a whole day, a whole battery of testing. And what that revealed is that sort of in terms of intelligence, I was in the top 90th percentile, but in terms of reading, I was in the bottom 10 percentile. So I read like a 4th grader, but I got by just because I could figure stuff out.
That was exactly my story too, because when I came from Haiti at the age of 4, I was identified as a gifted child, and I was supposed to skip a grade. They were really excited about the intellectual potential of me as a kid, but I don't know whether it was the language barrier or whether it was a cognitive thing that was happening within me, but reading out loud, oh my gosh. And I'm an actor. And so people want you to cold read all the time. So how did you navigate that? And did they give you tools?
Yeah, some tools. I think it really wasn't until I was an adult and out of school that I found coping strategies that really helped me. I think getting things done, that book of productivity, the big insight there was that our sort of cognitive memory, working memory is what it's called, is limited. So the trick there is to write down everything that's in your brain, right? So like write down to-dos, write down things. And I was like, that's why I could never do my homework, because I could remember what I had to do, right? And no one sort of taught me, like, as soon as, you think it, write it down, or as soon as it's assigned to you, write it down. Like, that process wasn't cultivated. So school was hard. College was hard. I didn't make it through both. But after school, I started reading a lot more about productivity like that. And then I read another book, The Dyslexic Advantage, Unlocking the Hidden Potential of the Dyslexic Brain. That book really did it, because it basically says that, like, there are 4 superpowers that dyslexic people have. There's cognitive reasoning, which is sort of you can see, connective reasoning is what it's called. You can see everything on a tapestry and you can make connections between everything and anything. There's spatial reasoning, so you can picture an object in your mind and sort of rotate around it and see it in 3D, which is why so many dyslexics become architects. Then there's business reasoning, which is basically project management, right? Like, if I want to schedule the podcast on this day, what are the steps leading up that I have to complete to make it happen? And then finally, narrative reasoning, which is storytelling, how to structure a story. And when I read the book, I totally ignored that section. I was like, narrative reasoning, that never really makes sense. Right out. And then, like, 10 years later, when I sat down to write the book, and I knew nothing about so I started writing and I knew nothing about writing, like a narrative story. So I didn't know what a scene was, didn't really know, like, the hero's journey or any of that. And then when I was doing it, I realized, oh, this plays right into my superpower, because a lot of narrative theory is connecting events in time. And I was like, oh, that's easy. I do that all the time. I'm like, this led to this.
Yeah.
So that's kind of my journey with dyslexia.
Wow. And once you figured out that you were dyslexic and had these coping mechanisms underneath you, it then led you to writing, and writing more consistently. Yeah. And that blossomed into a full book. So how long did it take you to write your book?
So it's been 6 years at this point. And that's not writing that's not writing every day for 6 years. What I did is I wrote the book in chunks. So I wrote, I took a quarter of the book, Act 1, and I worked on that. And then I worked on half of Act 2, the second half of Act 2. And I would do that about 6 months at a time. So I'd work roughly 3 to 4 months, or 3 to 6 months at a time on one particular section in depth. And then, life would not get in the way, but, I coached ultimate Frisbee, and that was, it's hard to write and also be there for the kids. So then, once the season or whatever was over, I'd come back to the writing. And in the meantime, I, get ideas about the next iteration. And so I kept doing that for 6 years, and I finally got to the manuscript, which I have now. And I'm starting to send it out to literary agents, and then look for a publisher. And based on the feedback I'm getting, I already have some ideas for the next rewrite modifications that I want to do. So it's an ongoing process.
That's amazing. That's amazing that you're able to have the perseverance and the tenacity to keep on going. Right. Yeah. One of the things that has helped me in reading is reading out loud, and just connecting the thoughts and breathing at the punctuation has really helped me just cognitively when it comes to my dyslexia. Do you have tools like that as well?
Audiobooks.
Yeah, I listen to audiobooks too, copious amounts. I go through hundreds a year.
Yeah, so do I. I mean, that was the big thing. I think one thing I realized about dyslexia is a lot of people say that they tell me when they read, they do the character voices in their head, right? And whenever I read, it was just this monotone, the quick brown fox, and I don't.
Yeah.
I'm spending so much energy, decoding the words that I can't enjoy the story. And audiobooks, they not only read it, but some of them do great voice acting. So it draws you in, and you can like just enjoy the story. So I've done tons of books on tape, but then it was something else to like sit with a book and look at how it was structured. So I started doing that when I was writing. Like I would sit with a couple of the books are here, like The Girl with All the Gifts, Kite Runner, and I would, have the audio playing in the background and looking at the words on the page. So it's reading it, but I get to experience what it's like to read a book as, like everyone else, I guess. And that, you could see what a book looked like. The structure of it really jumped off the page. And so when I was writing my book, I could like look at a scene I'd written and tell just by the sort of visual pattern if it was like consistent with that, or if I needed to do some editing because it was kind of a mess. So, it's all about like the way I think about it is like dyslexia isn't a disability, even though a lot of people will frame it in that way. I think it's the other side of the coin, right? Like there's creativity, and then I don't know what the consistency, let's say. And when we're not able to do consistent work in school, we're labeled learning disabled, but I can learn just fine. Thank you very much. Like I've taught myself tons of stuff. With dyslexia, I'd never go around saying, well, you're creatively disabled, right? Like you don't have good ideas because you're not creative. And I think that's the other way to look at it, that it's a different set of skills that complements the more consistent skills that a lot of my peers have.
Well, dyslexia is a fairly new diagnosis. It's just within the last, 60 years, people are having a deeper understanding of what it is, of what happens cognitively to someone who just learns differently. And there's a spectrum to it. When I did my research on dyslexia, I came to understand that some people are more overt than others. And something that we all should understand about the variance of the mind is that it's all a spectrum.
Right.
I don't know if you've watched Dating on the Spectrum or Love on the Spectrum on
No, I haven't.
Netflix.
I'm aware of the show, but I haven't watched it yet.
It's fascinating because it shows people with autism dating, and it shows the variance of depth of autism. And I have a cousin who's autistic, and so I have seen firsthand just what that looks like when it's severe and what that looks like when it's minor, because I have friends who are autistic and you would just never know. And I think dyslexia is just one of those very invisible things. It's not a disability. I don't believe that it's a disability either. I think that it's just us as humans understanding that we all think differently. We all process things differently at different rates. And it doesn't mean that we're unintelligent. It just means that we just need to find a different route to get to the same destination.
Right. Yeah. And I think that was one of the tough things about traditional schooling is that if you don't fit that mold, then you're sort of labeled as broken. That was one of the things I wrestled with. But you're absolutely right. And that's what I was trying to say is that it's a spectrum. On one side, you have consistency and the ability to, showing up every day and writing the book was so hard for me because, like we were saying, I have like 10 different things that I want to be working on every day. So doing that same exact thing every single day took a lot of discipline on my part. But I know for some of my friends, that's easy. That's just like, yeah, they're in that routine. On the flip side, I think so that's one end of the spectrum. And then on the other side is dyslexia, where you have these like creative gifts where you can see the big picture. So when I started working on the book, it was actually an Instagram post that I wrote. It was a couple lines I was trying to work something out. And I realized when I read what I'd written that if I post this, then it's just me sort of emotionally dumping. And that the person on the other side isn't going to understand what I'm trying to get to without understanding the history of my relationship with this person. And then it sort of popped into my head, right? This like the hero's journey, the idea that this moment was connected to something that happened all the way back when I was 16. And that the only way to tell that story would be to, go back in time and write it in that way. So I could see the vision of the story from the very beginning. And so much of the writing process for me has been about like carving, chiseling away what's not that story or what doesn't serve that story. So it's learning how to develop characters, learning how to do descriptive, like narrative description, which is something I struggle with, or that I wasn't as confident with. Like, I feel like I'm pretty good at dialogue because I remember, I can hear the way they talk and the inflections in my head, right? Like, that's one of my superpowers. So dialogue I was like, okay, my brother sounds like this, my mother sounds like this, my sister sounds like this, like easy. But then structuring the scenes and telling a complex interwoven story, that was the real work, right? Because just jotting thoughts down on the page doesn't make it a story. I think it's still important. I think people should still tell their stories, but taking it to the level that I'm trying to get to maybe isn't for everyone. And I think that's fine. That's okay.
I love that you know your superpower. I think everyone should identify their superpower. And for those who aren't familiar with Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, can you just break down the tenets of the hero's journey? Because I'm fascinated with it as well, because I'm a writer and I'm a storyteller, of understanding the formula of the hero's journey.
So the hero's journey, I think people sometimes get hung up on the word hero, that, there's a masculine connotation to it. And I totally understand that. I think what I would say is it's less about the masculine feminine journey and more about the journey. Like the important word in that is the journey. It's simply this pattern that all of our experiences follow, and being able to see and understand that pattern is the gold, right? So seeing the hero's journey for my documentary film, seeing the hero's journey for my book, that was so empowering for me because I could see my life, which up to that point had felt very isolating and disconnected from the rest of the world. I could see my experiences in that context. That no, I wasn't alone. It was just it's part of the human experience, but in this different way. So rather than going into the hero's journey, which I think is not complicated, but it takes a while to break down. I have a different one, which is called the circle method, which is from Dan Harmon, who's the creator of Rick and Morty. And I've modified the language a little bit, but the basic structure of a story is you have a character in a zone of comfort, but then something unexpected happens. They enter an unfamiliar situation, adapt to it, get what they wanted, pay a heavy price for it, then return to the familiar, having learned an important life lesson. And it's that circle that you see not just in like a work, like not just in the book as a whole, but in every single sort of scene and chapter. It's sort of that idea of Russian dolls, that every piece of the story has this sort of circular path or the same beats and points, right? That's maybe getting too much in the weeds, but
no,
just
it's great.
Yeah,
it's great, and I think that people should know that whether they know it or not, you're familiar with this this structure because you see it in films, you hear it in audiobooks, you read it in every story that's great, Lord of the Rings, everyone, The Hobbit, all of those stories, Star Trek, have this kind of structure of this hero coming into themselves, coming into their heroism.
Yeah. And it's like, thinking of my own, of the story of the book in those terms is like you have a character in a comfort zone. I was adoptee growing up in a regular family. And then we get this phone call out of the blue saying that my adoptive family had been searching for me for 14 years. And so I enter this unfamiliar situation of life in Central America, of meeting this family that looks like me, but I can't communicate with. So having to navigate that. And then I adapt to it, right? I start to get familiar with the culture and the language, and I go on adventures, right? I climb volcanoes and dance salsa at 2 a.m. and, experience an earthquake, all these really incredible moments. And I kind of get what I was looking for, which is this family connection. But then I pay a heavy price for it, which is I wasn't able to have 2 lives. A life here in the United States focused around your career, and a life in Central America focused around family. And so the price I paid was I lost a lot of my career, kind of took a hit during those years. And then eventually I found my way back to back home with a coaching job at the high school that I attended when I was younger. And that gave me the opportunity to really sit down and reflect on the life lessons that I'd learned, which is what, the product of which was the book. So just being able to see your life experiences in that pattern that people throughout time have experienced is so rewarding, right? Especially for someone like me, or maybe many other adoptees who felt very isolated and alone growing up.
I want to continue to pick your mind because it's fascinating to me. On your website, you have failure as a topic. You list failure, adoption, making art, and taking risks. And that is extraordinary because I don't think I've ever seen anyone list failure as a topic. So let's go into why you listed it as a topic and how it's come up for you.
So I think it goes back to kind of what we were talking about, dyslexia in school, that the narrative that I was told and maybe internalized a bit was that if I didn't succeed academically, then I was a failure. If I didn't succeed with my career, which here in the United States, it's if you don't have the car, the house, the family, by these age milestones, then you're a failure. I don't think it's ever explicitly stated that way, but that is what so many people feel, right? Is that if you don't live up to these cultural expectations, then you're a failure. And I think what I've learned is that failure is part of, it's not just part of life, but it is my ability to withstand failure is my superpower. It is sort of one of my superpowers. I started writing this book without knowing what a scene was, right? And I am just sort of either neurotic enough or dedicated enough to sit there day after day, bang my head against the wall until I crack it, right? Until I really understand story at the fundamental level. And not everyone is willing to do that. I think a lot of people get hung up on, they write their first draft of a chapter or something, and then they read it, and it's not good. My first draft wasn't good. I tried to write, tried to write like 19 blog posts. and it was like 20,000 words. And I was reading it back and I realized like, I didn't write it. Like, this doesn't make sense. And what I had written was an outline for a book. It wasn't a story. I'd been aiming to tell a story, but what I had written was an outline. So I think a lot of people at that point say, well, I'm no good. Like, I as a person am inherently flawed and I'm throwing in the towel and I give up. In my approach, and I think maybe I get this from my programming background, is I lean into that, right? Like, so much of programming is just you type something into the computer and it says, and you do it again. And you keep going and going until you figure out what you're trying to do. So I took that mentality into the writing process and just kept leaning into it. Draft 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then I worked with an editor. And after 15 weeks of working with the editor, we decided that I had to go back and rewrite the entire thing, which took me another 2 years, right? And I'm going through it every, it would take me 6 months to rewrite a quarter of the book. And I'm just sitting there like, failing every single day at being a writer until I wasn't anymore, right? And so I think that is one of the reasons why failure, I think, is so important. Giving ourselves permission to fail and to not beat ourselves up about it. I think that is so important. And that's one of the reasons why I talk about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, then let's talk about this book. We keep on circling around this topic of this book. I want to know what's in it. What makes it special for you?
Hey, I want to share with you something that has changed my life. It's more like someone, my therapist. Why is she so important? Well, because I want to win in this life. I want to break through the carousel of stories I've compiled that hold me back, that keep me from expanding into my full potentiality. Stories of unworthiness, not enoughness, and even stories of questioning why I am here. I also want to stop dumping my unsorted feelings on the people around me and reacting with the same behavioral patterns that keep me stuck. Conversations with my therapist have made me more confident, clearer in my intention, and more centered in my spirit. That is why I am elated that we are sponsored by BetterHelp, where you can, from wherever you happen to be right now, match with a therapist tailored to your exact needs. With BetterHelp, you can tap into a network of over 30,000 licensed and experienced therapists who can help you with a wide range of issues. Someone who you can text at any time and schedule online for either a chat, Zoom, or phone call. And if it turns out that your therapist isn't the right fit, you can switch to a new therapist at no additional cost. Visit the link in the show notes, betterhelp.com, when they were young, to get 10% off the first month. You need to click the link in the show notes in order to get the 10% discount. I want to see you win, beloved. Let's do it together. Visit the link, betterhelp.com, when they were young.
There's a lot that makes it special. I think for me, it is the culmination of my experiences. So we just talked about the hero's journey and how you go out into the unknown and have an adventure, and you return home having learned an important lesson. I think the book is so many of the lessons that I learned during that time period, the 20 years that I spent getting to know and live with my birth family. And there were, incredible moments as I talked about, climbing volcanoes and stuff like that, where like it was this dream almost, right? Where I'm living this life that I had imagined since I was young, right? And then as as our lives become more intertwined, I'm having to choose between my life in the US and a life down there, kind of in the family business. And I'm just working I'm just working myself into the ground, trying to balance all these things, right? The demands of two different cultures, the expectations of two very different families.
And what culture is that? Just so people know.
Yeah.
And the title of the book.
Yeah. So the title of the book is Waking from Innocent Dreams. And the two cultures are, sort of, well, my adoptive father is originally from Germany. He moved to Canada after the war, and after World War II, that is. And he was sort of like very, I don't want to say strict, but he was very sort of like everything in order, very German, right? Like everything is it. We're doing this, and this, right? So the opening scene of the book is we're on family vacation, and he's listing exactly what the itinerary for the day is, right? So that's my adoptive family. Very organized, wonderful human beings, but very structured in the way that they do things. Then my biological family, they're originally from El Salvador. And they had to leave El Salvador during the Civil War. And I'm trying to say this without like, the way that they worked in the world was very chaotic, at least from what I'd been grown up in. And
it's contrasting.
Yeah. And I don't want that to be a negative thing, because I think it's like one of the core principles of storytelling is it's all about order and chaos. And it's not about saying like one is bad and one is good. Mm-hmm. It's simply that contrast of ways of handling the world. And the protagonist has to choose how is he or she going to exist in the world? Are they going to be ordered and structured like their adoptive parents, or chaotic and free-spirited like their biological family, right? Like, so the story of the book is it's my experience reuniting with with my biological family, then going down there, getting to know them, spending years down there, and having to, like, as I said, navigate a very structured cultural upbringing in the United States versus more of a free-flowing existence in Central America that is grounded so closely in the family, right? Like, so in Central America on Sunday afternoons, you go out on a trip with the family. And like that's so wonderful. At the same time, like there were days when I was just like, I just want to like hang out with my friends on Skype and like just chill. And we have to drive to the volcano, which is an hour away. So like, one isn't better than the other. They're simply different. And so as I developed these two different lives, it obviously everything got more complicated to the point where about 10 years ago now, everything kind of fell apart. That this sort of existence that I had cultivated for 15 years or so, I just watched it like completely fall apart. And that was devastating. Watching so I went down and worked in the family business, and I built this whole computer system for them and helped them organize the business, and then just sort of watching all of that crumble. And then, as I said, like my career, that kind of dried up. And then it was this emotional, I'm reading this book called Wintering, and that's the word that's stuck in my head at the moment. Wintering, yeah. Mm. Where you're just, I couldn't go on. Like I wanted to tell my family story since I was 16, since we got that phone call. And so it just reached this point where I couldn't go on like that. And I really had to look inward and confront a lot of that anger and hurt that I was feeling from everything that happened with the family, and evaluate, so the book is Waking from Innocent Dreams. And it was really that. It was this awakening where I could look back at these lived experiences in a new light and see them for what they were, which wasn't always pleasant, let's say, which wasn't always good. And to see how difficult life had been for my biological siblings, for my older brother and sister. And so part of the book is, or the whole point of the book is me trying to make sense of all of that, and just say to other people who have been through similar situations, like, this is really hard and there's no right answer. And going back to failure, like, the whole time I'm just fumbling around in the dark. There's no guide. There's no, like when your biological sister calls you up and is having, a really hard time, and you have to console her at night, and you choose to go down and help her, and people around you are, not discouraging you, but concerned for that, right? Like, well, you're like, what do I do here? What do I do in this situation, right? Like, she's in need and I want to be there for her. How can I not go? How can I not? And then to see, like, your own family, your biological family, not being there for her either, you're so much of that, those years were being caught in the middle between these two different lives. So that's what I wanted to write about.
And where are you now with your family? You said that 10 years ago it all fell apart. Is it coming back together piece by piece?
Some of it, I think some of it may never come back together, which is, really tough. But I think I've gained a deeper understanding of family, and the appreciation or the realization that, at least for me as an adopted child, I grew up with these dreams of what it was like to live with my biological family, of what that experience would be like. And then I got that in some ways, like, that dream came true. And we had this second chance to be a family together, but it wasn't enough, and it wasn't my fault or anyone's fault. It's just that my birth family comes with their own sets of struggles and traumas and idiosyncrasies, and being able to see that and appreciate that, that's really hard, right? Like, because it means letting go of that dream that you have as a little kid. But it also meant that I could define family for myself, which I think was really empowering. And while some of those relationships, I don't know if they'll ever return to what they were, others have become stronger because of it. I think especially with my biological siblings, like, they mean the world to me, and, like, we have such a wonderful relationship. And I think that being able to help them was I don't want to say the point of all of this, but the outcome, the best outcome from all of this was just being able to be there for them and to have some sort of positive impact on their lives.
I can empathize with your story, Nelson, because I had a vision for my reunification. I reunified at 13 and 27, and I know that you reunified at 16, correct?
Yep.
And I hear stories of adoptees going back, and some are able to integrate, like yourself, which is amazing. And I commend you for that, because that was a huge risk that you took, and that's on your list. And it takes a tremendous amount of courage and open-heartedness to even endeavor to do something like that. A lot of people can't even begin to fathom what that's like, but we know what that's like, right? And we also know what it's like when that vision of of reunification, of family is ruptured by reality and all of these personalities that you're trying to balance, the balancing act of the adoptive family. And a lot of these adoptive families that we adoptees who are coming from other cultures are adopted into are way more Eurocentric, and they have Eurocentric sensibilities. It is very much a spiritual and emotional warfare in some way, because we're being torn one way and reprogrammed another way. And a lot of times it's faster than our body, our nervous system can regulate. And so giving yourself grace that you even attempted that, giving yourself grace that you were able to venture into those relationships at all. I'm so impressed by you. It's quite beautiful to behold. I want to make sure that we touch on the topic of the disappearing children and how that has informed your work and your writing. Does that show up in your book?
Yeah, it's something that I'm working on including more of. I think with each draft of the book, you add another layer to it, and it becomes more complex or more, you adjust it, right? Like it's not this linear path. Like, so one of my goals with this sort of next round of editing is to get a little more of the history of El Salvador into the book, a little more of this idea of forced disappearances. And that word disappeared is not something that we sort of, that's in the cultural narrative here in the United States, but it does have its origins in the United States, which I think is interesting. That throughout Central and South America in the 70s, 80s, and maybe a little bit into the 90s, there was this phenomenon of forcibly disappearing people. Most famously is probably in Argentina, where political opposition, people who were politically opposing the government, would be taken and flown via helicopter and dumped into the ocean. And the term disappeared comes from the former president of Argentina, who, when pressed about the missing in his country, so this was Jorge Vidala is his name, and he's sort of credited with coming up with this word. And during a press conference, he was pressed about someone who was missing. And he said, as long as he is missing, he cannot have any special treatment. He is an unknown. He doesn't have an identity. He doesn't exist, neither dead nor alive. He is disappeared. And like that is, it's so chilling in a way, right? Like he's saying, no body, no crime. That if you can't prove that this person is missing, there's nothing we can do here. So forced disappearances were used as a way to silence political opposition. And then in El Salvador, they were used as a way as a scare tactic, essentially, to punish peasants who were helping the revolutionaries. So I have a friend of mine who the army was walking through her village, and they stopped at her house and they pointed a gun at her mother and said, give me the child here or I'll kill you and take all your children, something along those lines. And so my friend was taken and then put up for adoption, ended up here in the Boston area, and like me, was eventually reunited with her family. But that idea of forcibly disappearing people, that originated, we think, from the School of the Americas, right? That many of the people who used this technique were trained at the School of Americas. And so it is a sort of a dark part of our history here. But the disappeared children of El Salvador specifically are children who were forcibly separated from their families during the war. Some of them were put into adoption and ended up in the United States, but some of them ended up in El Salvador, in the country. I know of one person who was adopted to a family in Italy, and they were raised without any knowledge of what happened to them. So when I was 16 and we found out about my family, I originally thought I was adopted from Honduras. So that the truth of my existence of who I was before that was intentionally kept from my adoptive parents. So not only was there the shock of like, oh, you have family that's been looking for you, but then the cultural, then the history of the country, of which my biological parents were right in the middle of. So they were both revolutionaries in the Civil War in El Salvador. And I was separated from them during a mission that took place in Honduras. There's a lot of detail in the story, so maybe we don't have time to get into it. But I was then kept in an orphanage for a year before I was adopted to the United States. And in the investigative report, there is this that my adoptive family was presented with that I got to read. There's this picture of the head of the Honduran police, and he's holding my hand in one of the newspaper pictures that appeared shortly after. So there's this picture of the head of the Honduran, or like the second in command in the Honduran police, and he's holding my hand, and it's in the newspaper. It appeared in the newspaper in Honduras. And that man was later convicted of war crimes for making people disappear. So, here I am as a little kid in the midst of all this history. So that was a whole nother thing to unpack and learn about. And that is sort of more of the focus of the documentary film, which is on the phenomenon of forced disappearances and on what it means to have family members who have been forcibly taken like that.
And what's the name of your documentary film?
So the documentary film is called Identifying Nelson, Buscando a Roberto. So it's, identifying Nelson, looking for Roberto is the translation.
And you're fairly new to filmmaking. How did that transition happen? Was that just a natural progression of your artistry, or something else prompted it?
So as the theme of this conversation is, I have no idea what I'm doing and I just make it up. I ended up having a close friend. So he was my camp counselor many, many years ago at summer camp, the first time I went to summer camp. And we reconnected on Facebook in 2010 or so. And he ended up working in TV and film production in LA. And at that time, I was writing on another blog, Anna's Miracle, which was sort of the very first iteration of the book, or at least my attempt at writing and trying to process all this stuff. And for that site, I was doing live streams with my family, talking about, what my adoptive family went through, what a shock it was, to learn about our story, and with my biological family about what it was like growing up with a sibling who had been missing. So I was doing all that, and he saw it and just sort of was so impressed by it that he said, I want to help you any way that I can. And at first that was just sending some equipment. But then later, as we got to know each other, he's like, well, have you ever thought of doing a documentary film? I had not. I had no idea what I was doing. So we jumped in blindly, and we posted the project on Kickstarter, and we ended up being one of the first 10,000 successful projects on that site. We raised $15,000, went down to El Salvador for this historic Day of the Disappeared, which was the first time that the Salvadoran government had publicly acknowledged the existence of disappeared children. And we filmed, we got to meet the president, we got to meet other children who were forcibly taken from their families. I got to interview my family about their experiences during the war. And we got all this amazing footage, and we started working on the documentary film. And then we hit a wall maybe 2 years in where we were talking past each other. We weren't arguing, we weren't yelling at each other, but we couldn't make any progress on the film. Telling stories at that level is really hard. But that is when I started learning about story structure and narrative theory, and it just unlocked something for both of us where I could walk, I could be the storyteller and be like, okay, these are the beats we have to meet, and here's our hero's journey arc, and da-da-da-da. And he's great at the history of like researching that quote about Vidala, that's his contribution, as well as like just knowing what looks good on camera, that kind of stuff. So it ended up being this amazing partnership where not only did we get to work on the film, but like he's one of my closest confidants, because like as you're working through the film, there's some really really difficult emotions around grief and loss, and that I'm, trying to work through. And he's there listening and responding and trying to help me make sense of it all, So it turned out to be an amazingly beautiful partnership.
And can we watch this film now? Where is it available?
Not yet. That's always the question that gets me. Yeah. No, we're still working on it. Hopefully soon. We are very close. We have a rough cut that is watchable that we've shown to people, but we want to polish it up a little bit more, get some sort of finishing funds so that we can polish it, and then hopefully take it to, like a Netflix or something. Who knows? Distribution is its own sort of thing. So we hope very soon is the short answer. But, these are both kind of passion projects, and they take a long time. And I think that's where, the failure piece comes in too, is that like, you got to be kind to yourself when it takes so much longer than you ever expected to finish things like that.
Yeah. But I love the time that you're taking on each one of these projects, right? And it gives us all permission to just go slowly, go thoroughly, and go gently as we work through some of these things that are very cathartic, very close to home, but absolutely necessary to unpack and to share.
Yeah, I mean, that journey to really examine what I've been through, both through the documentary film and the book, that was not easy by any stretch. There were days when I would write just, I don't know, 500 to 700 words for the book, and I would just be in tears and like just shut down for the rest of the day, because you have to go to those places. You have to recreate those feelings of longing and hurt and anguish that you went through for it to resonate with the reader. And that was sort of the early drafts where it was me just trying to get these emotions out and on the page. And then what happened that was, so empowering for me was that it slowly turned into the craft of it. Like I fell in love with the craft of storytelling. And so eventually it became less about like how this moment made me feel and about the craft of, how do I set that up? How do I make this resonate with the reader the way it resonated with me, the way it felt for me? How do I create those moments? And based on the feedback that I've gotten from the people, the early readers who have read it, I think it's working. It's there. Like they really strongly resonate with it. So that's just been an amazing journey too. Like this past year, so I sort of finished the manuscript draft in its current form about a year ago. And last year I was just giving it to people and talking with them. And I had some of the most incredible conversations with people about the story, about what they took from it, about it was sort of like everything I was trying to say, people were receiving, which was a truly incredible feeling. And that, like, I'm an athlete. I played a lot of sports, so it's like when you get a knot in your muscles, and it's tight for such a long time. And I didn't realize that I had this tight, emotional knot, let's say. And then it finally started to release and relax, and like that transformation alone was incredible, and worth, even if the book doesn't sell that well, it's all been worth it at this point.
I'm an athlete too, so I totally get that analogy, because when it does release, like I have a tight hamstring, or I did, other things release. You had no idea that it was not the only knot. There were many that were affected by this. So,
and I think building on that metaphor, I think that's the way one can approach emotional trauma too. Is that if you try to do too much, it doesn't. You keep just getting hurt and come back. And like when stuff started to fall apart with my family, that's sort of what it felt like, that I was still trying to sprint forward, even though my hamstring was like aching in pain. And like, it was my body's way of saying, like, no, you have to slow down. You have to face this. You have to deal with it. Doesn't mean that you like go out and stretch for 6 hours the next day, right? Like it means that you come back, and just like you said, you take care of yourself. You figure out what works, what helps you process. And then, little by little, those muscles, those wounds start to heal. And then once you can run again, both literally and figuratively, it's so freeing, right? You're like, oh, this thing that has been bothering me for so long it might come back. It probably will come back, but it's not a drag on the system, right? It's not slowing me down the way it was before. And I know how to take care of myself when it flares up again.
Exactly. You know how to recover. Where can they find you? Where can they read and engage with you?
Yeah. So my website is nelsonroberto.com. You can just also Google Nelson Roberto and it should pop up. I'm on Instagram. I think it's De Witt N19. But that is linked to on my website. So going to the website is probably the best way to find me.
I think it is.
Yeah. And there's lots of great stories there too.
There are. I can attest to that. And my final question that I ask all of my guests, because we like to encourage courage here. And from this conversation, I can tell that you are about empowerment. You are about finding your superpower. Where in your life are you courageous, Nelson?
I've been thinking about this a lot to prepare. And I think there are two things that come to mind. One is looking inward. When we look inward, I think that's a place to be courageous, because it is hard. Like, it is so hard to face those, whether it's trauma or whatever difficult emotions that you're facing, right? But doing that and finding a way that works for you is so important. And then I think the other place courage is really important is in sharing your story. So in the hero's journey, there's this idea of the return. Is that as I said before, the protagonist has to go out into the world, have an adventure, and then return home, and they share their life lesson. We see this return in like Star Wars, right, where the group comes back and they're in this cathedral. But I think there's another important aspect to the return, and this comes from Sebastian Junger. He's a writer. He wrote this book, Tribes. He also wrote Perfect Storm. And in the book Tribe, he talks about how Native Americans would have reintegration ceremonies So when the warriors would go out, they'd come back from battle and they would go through these purification ceremonies. And what he sort of alludes to in the book is that the real purpose was that the trauma of war is really tough, right? But that trauma was not contained within the individual. That the whole village would hold space for that trauma and those difficult events. And so when I think about courage, it's about sharing your story, because that is such an important part of the return of, we're having this conversation, but I said this in another podcast, but you, the listener, you're just as important to this conversation, because we can have this conversation, but if no one listens, I don't know what I'm trying to say other than that sharing of our truth is so scary, but it's how we heal. That is the path home. That's what I'm trying to say.
Another beautiful episode. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you to my guest today. If you liked this episode, the best way to support me and this work is to write an iTunes review, a 5-star review. This helps us reach the top of searches and helps more people to find us. And if you personally want to connect, please reach out on Instagram or Facebook. And I have some great resource material on my website at laniceantoineshelley.com. So go on over there too. Until next we meet, go gently and have courage, my love.